This video is brought to you by Sailrite. Visit Sailrite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. Winter is quickly approaching, and it's time to cover our outdoor furniture, including this fountain. A fountain like this will require a cover that is cone-shaped. In this DIY tutorial video, we're going to show you how to cut the fabric to the right shape and size for your cone project, whether it be a fountain like this or something similar. We'll also be covering how to sew up this cone shape with a round top and a skirt along the bottom. Let's get started and show you how to make your own cone-shaped cover for whatever shape and size application you may have. The first step is taking measurements. At the top of our object that we want to cover, we need to take a circumference measurement. This fountain features a woman, and we could measure the head, but that's very small. So what I'm doing is determining what type of round top do I want. Looks like 17 inches would be about perfect here. At the bottom, we want to measure the circumference around the widest part. That would be the bath here. And here I'm using a soft tape measure and measuring around till I run into the part where I began measuring. Our measurement for this fountain is 106 inches. Next, measure from the top of your structure to where the bottom circumference measurement was taken. This is a sloping length measurement. For us, it's 40 inches. For our cone cover, we want a skirt, so we'll measure from the bottom edge of the circumference measurement to the ground. Ours is 19 inches. On paper, roughly draw the structure you're trying to cover and then write down each of these measurements. Now we'll take those measurements and enter them in a special calculator designed for cones. You'll notice we didn't have to do any patterning. That's because we're going to use Sailrite's fabric calculator to determine the correct shape and size to cut the cone. Visit the Sailrite website and scroll to the bottom. There you will find a link called Fabric Calculator. Click on that. Here you will find a calculator for a multiple of projects. We're going to click on cones. Following the illustration above, we will enter the calculations for the circumference at the top, the circumference at the bottom, and the height. You can enter the amount you desire for a seam or a hem in these fields. The calculator assumes you want a half-inch seam. The fabric we selected is 62 inches in width. We've entered that and hit the calculate button. Now we know the amount of material that's required for the cone, and a list of instructions, and a cut panel rendering below. Let's go over these instructions in detail. Now, before we start entering the measurements in the Sailrite Fabric Calculator, we must consider the type of project we are fabricating. For us, it's an outdoor cover. And with any outdoor cover, making it too tight will make it difficult to remove and install. So for any circumference measurement that was measured that's tight against the structure, like this one down here, we will add at least 1, maybe 2 inches of extra material at that location. So our measurement is 106. We're going to make it 107. The top circumference for our cone, we measured at 17 inches, and we measured it rather loosely at 17 inches, so I don't need to add any extra there, so I'm going to put 17 inches. But for the bottom circumference, I measured it right up against the structure, and I measured 106, so I'm going to add 1 inch to that, so 107. Now for the height, I measured at 40 inches. I don't need any extra fabric for the height there, so we're going to leave that at the original measurement of 40 inches. And we're using a 62-inch wide fabric. Hit the calculate button, and there are instructions. We've chosen to use a Top Gun fabric from Sailrite. We'll lay that on the floor. A says, from the upper left-hand corner, that's over here, measure across the width of the fabric 26.54 for us. We'll place a mark there. Then measure straight down from that point 87.89 inches. This will create a rectangle, which is shown in red on the calculator. Though the calculator shows a rectangle and says to draw a rectangle, we're only putting points on the fabric. Now we're on B. B says from the upper left-hand corner, measure along the fabric 49.25. We're going to mark that.
Then we'll measure down from that point 43.94 and place a mark.
This mark may not actually be on the fabric as it is here. It may be on the floor or the tabletop that you're working on.
This mark, which we just put down, the calculator said this mark will be used as our pivot point. So from this point, draw an arc with a radius of 49.25 inside the rectangle which was created in step A. So we're going to tape onto the fabric. I love to use wax twine with a little bit of a knot at the top just to give it more friction right on that mark.
You can also just use string.
Now we'll measure the length of the line, which we want to be 49.25. As you can see, if it's done appropriately, 49.25 should be the end of the fabric, which it is here, if the tape measure came straight down from the other side. So there's our measurement. So at that point, I want to tie a pencil on. So I've cut my wax twine. Nice thing about wax twine is it doesn't really allow for much slippage because it's kind of waxy. And I'm just going to tie my pencil at that location. Now you really don't want this to slip when you do your arc, so I'm going to tape it down well, hoping that we don't get any slippage out of that.
If you have a second helper, you may want to have them hold on the anchor point at the end of the line where we taped it to the fabric, or the floor, depending on the size of the cone.
Right into the mark we made before. Perfect.
The main advantage of the cone calculator is the fact we don't need to perform the laborious task of patterning on the oddly shaped structure. Instead, we can simply take a few measurements, enter those in the calculator, and then we know the projected shape, as we're doing here.
And into that mark. That's perfect. We're now on C. From the upper left-hand corner, measure across the width of the fabric 41 inches. Place a mark there. Then we measure down, according to the calculator, 36.63 and mark the fabric, which is right there. That's straight down. This mark is the upper left-hand corner of a rectangle that measures 4.5 inches wide and 14.63 inches deep. We can draw that rectangle. Now I'm not going to draw that rectangle, I'm just going to mark those points. 14.63 right there, because we really just need points of reference to make sure that our radius is right. Now it says, using the same pivot point as we did for the larger arc, create a smaller arc with a radius of 8.25 inches inside the smaller rectangle. It's shown in green in the rendering. So we just need to measure over 8.25 at the end of the string. So 8.25 is right there. I'm not going to mark on my fabric because I don't want to ruin my fabric. And I'll place a mark. And I'm going to tie my pencil there. So I just made a knot here. Even though my point's down here, I can insert my pencil. And then, again, the wax thread makes it easy to make adjustments until the mark is on the pencil. Then I'll tie a double knot. Okay, now we just mark within that rectangle. Whoa! I noticed that my string moved, so I'm going to hold my finger over the string here. And now our marks are very close to our original marks, which is good. Now step D. Draw two lines connecting the ends of the two arcs and cut them out.
And now we'll cut this out with scissors.
Okay. Okay, we have our cone cut out, and we also have a top. Now the calculator does not account for this top up here. So if you're, depending on the amount of fabric that you need, and if your top is large, you may need extra fabric. Now our project also has a skirt that comes down here and is going to be sewn on. Again, the calculator does not account for that. So if you have a skirt, you'll need to add extra fabric than what the calculator says. The calculator only allows for this piece, not that, and no skirt.
Joining the sides of the cone is next. In a future chapter, we'll show how to make the cone top and the skirt if required.
Okay, now we're going to use double-sided tape, seam stick for canvas, and we're going to baste along one of the edges, doesn't matter which. This is a top gun fabric. It has no right side or wrong side, so it doesn't matter which side you apply the basting tape to. If your fabric had a right side and wrong side, you would apply the double-sided tape to the right side or outside of the cover. We peel off the transfer paper, revealing the glue, and now we will baste this side to that side. We just want to line up the sides. Nice thing about double-sided tape is that if you don't have it right, you can peel it up again and rebaste. I'll use the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler and put my finger on the metal part so that I don't break the acrylic ruler part, and apply pressure to the fabric, which helps to baste it securely in place. The needle plate on the Sailrite Ultrafeed sewing machine shows what a 1/2 inch is, 3/4 and 1 inch. We're going to take the deluxe 5.5 inch magnetic guide and place it on the 1/2 inch. This works like a fence on a table saw. Now my stitch is a 1/2 inch from the raw edge of the fabric. We're going to sew a straight stitch about 6 millimeters in length, doing some reversing at the beginning.
Please excuse the noise in the background. Someone is stapling an upholstery job using the Sailrite upholstery staple gun. To sew this top gun fabric, we're using V92 polyester thread available from Sailrite. We have a size number 20 needle in the sewing machine.
At the end, we'll do some reversing. Now I'm going to turn it right side out. Insert my arm all the way to the top and pull it out. Now the easiest thing is to just sew it like we did and turn it right side out and be done. But for a more secure stitch and probably a better looking job, you want to do a semi-flat felled seam, which means that the tail on the inside, this is a 1/2 inch, that tail. And what we're going to do is fold it over to one side and then stitch on the top side here. That's a semi-flat felled seam. The unfortunate thing about a semi-flat felled seam on a cone like this is that you have to force all this fabric in, starting at the large end and working to the small end, which we're going to show you how to do. So I could take it to the sewing machine and splay it apart as I'm sewing, but it's easier to take it to the table and splay it so that, and crease it well so that we're falling on that stitch that we just created. So I'm splaying it open, pulling left and right, and then I'll use a heavy object like the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler and crease the fabric well. So it wants to fold in that position, so we don't have to concentrate as much on creating the semi-flat felled seam when we're trying to manipulate this cone into the sewing machine. So my tail is facing this direction. Doesn't really matter which way the tail goes for this kind of application. It does for other applications where water's going to be running across the seam, but the water's going to be running down the seam here, so it doesn't matter. My tail's on this side, so I'm going to sew my stitch on that side. Notice my fabric is splayed out and I don't have any extra layers underneath. You got to check that to make sure that you're not sewing through any part of the cover. So we'll start here at this side. I'm going to use my presser foot as a guide to keep it up against this splayed out stitch, or the first stitch I should say. Do some reversing as normal. I'm going to splay my fabric out as I go. It should fold nicely on that fold that we created on the table. I can feel that I'm not sewing through anything besides my fabric. You can feel where there might be extra fabric underneath with your hands, and I can feel the tail still in the right spot. Almost there. Everything's out of the way. As you can see, the white table underneath. A little bit of reversing. Our semi-flat felt seam is done.
Since this is a cover, we want to add a round top. We're going to show you how to do that next.
If your cone needs a top, in this situation it'll be a circle that goes on, you can scroll down after step D and you'll read that if a fabric circle will be attached to the top of the cone, its diameter with seam allowance will be 6.73 inches. So the fabric calculator says we need a circle with a diameter of 6.75. We need to divide that by 2 to get the radius, and it's 3.375. This Sailrite canvas patterning ruler has increments of a quarter inch, and we need 3.375, so we're going to do 3.5 inches. And then we'll cut the circle a little bit smaller. So we simply just want to insert our awl in the small circle, and the pencil in 3.5 inches and draw a circle. Now, if you don't have the Sailrite canvas patterning ruler, you can use a compass or a pencil on a string. So this is slightly large, so I'm going to cut it a little bit small. So the circle goes on the inside, and we want to match up these edges, and we want to sew a 1/2 inch from the edges as we sew the circle in place. The Sailrite Ultrafeed has a 1/2 inch marked on the needle plate. So as I sew, I'm going to grab the circle and the barrel basically and line it up. And as you're sewing, if the circle or if the barrel needs moved, you need to move that so you can actually work with the flat piece in front of the sewing machine foot.
What I'm calling the barrel or the cone, I like to keep in a straight line. In other words, it's feeding straight to the presser foot. While the circle, I am lining up it with the edge of the cone as I sew. So I'm pulling the circle over to match it up.
I bury my needle when I move the fabric around. I'm going to roll my barrel so I'm working with a flat part again. Then when you get to the end, you can do some reversing, but I notice I'm a little bit off here. You can see it there, so I'm going to actually sew up to there and do some reversing. There we go. So our cone is wrong side out. We're going to flip it so it's right side out. Or turn it so it's right side out, I should say. So here's what the cone looks like. We do not put a top stitch on a cone like this. It's very difficult to do. So only one stitch like this. This is typical.
Our cover requires that a skirt be sewn around the perimeter of the cone. That's next.
The bottom of our cone needs a skirt, and the bottom circumference is 107 inches for us. So I'm going to make a skirt that is longer than 107 inches. In other words, a rectangular piece of fabric. I'll probably make it 117 to 120 inches long. And we know, according to the measurements we took, we need this skirt to be about 19 inches. So I'm going to add a 1/2 inch for seam allowance at the top, and I'm going to add 1 inch for seam allowance at the bottom. Because I don't want to use a lot of fabric, I'm going to do this from basically almost 1 yard of fabric. So I'm going to cut 3 strips and then sew them together to make the overall length of about 100 and so I think I said 117 inches. So we're going to measure up 20.5 inches for us.
The Sailrite Cone Calculator does not account for the amount of material for this skirt, so you'll need to add that in the amount of material that you order.
Mark it in 2 spots so we can draw a straight line.
If you need a skirt, you can use this equation to figure the amount of fabric required. If you'd like to make one long strip, you can do so. It just takes more fabric. The leftover fabric that we have requires us to cut 3 strips.
Okay, we're starting with just 2 panels. We have several to sew together to make our length. I'm just matching up the raw edges, and we want to sew a 1/2 inch from the raw edge. I can use this as a guide.
This is a straight stitch that's about a 1/2 inch away from the raw edges of the fabric. We're going to create a semi-flat filled seam here as well.
Then what we'll do is we'll splay it open to create our semi-flat felled seam.
Since this seam will be vertical, no water will run into the seam, so it doesn't matter which side the tail is on when we sew the top stitch.
Making sure I'm pulling it apart as I sew to make sure it's on that first stitch. Scrolling up the fabric makes it a lot easier to get it through the arm of the sewing machine without getting in the way.
That makes it much easier.
So now the point of the next panel is that outside surfaces must face each other. This is obviously the outside surface because there's a stitch here. So this will be the outside surface of this panel. And then we'll sew this together in the same manner. Okay, so here you can see the cone on top of my skirt. So the outside surfaces, this is the outside surface and this is the outside surface, are facing each other. The arm of the sewing machine is going to be here, so I put my cone on the top here. So we'll carry this over to the sewing machine and we will start sewing a few inches from the edge. We're going to leave this unsewn so that we can join it up before we sew all around the perimeter. So I'll basically start sewing anywhere in here. I'm not going to worry about this seam coming down. You can sew anywhere, start anywhere on the cone. And I'm not even going to do any reversing at the beginning because I'm going to sew over those stitches. So all we have to do is line up the edges as we sew around the perimeter. This is our first stitch of the semi-flat felled seam. My rectangle's below, my cone's on top. I believe it's easier to do this by having one hand on my rectangular piece down here and then one hand guiding the cone. And then you can guide both panels. See, I have control of the bottom panel and I have control of the top panel. Then when I stop, I'll reposition my hands and continue to sew until I get to the point where I need to stop again. My fabric has a curl in it, so I'll straighten out that curl and continue sewing. Make sure this fabric doesn't get sewn in the way. And you may need to roll the cone around as you're sewing this because obviously you're sewing around a large circumference. And I'm letting the Sailrite Ultra Feed walking foot do the pulling. All I'm doing is the guiding of both panels as I sew them. That's the beauty of a walking foot sewing machine. Okay, we're almost to the point where we began sewing. This is our stitch that has to be sewn to this. But I want to get a little bit closer because it'll just make it easier for determining the right size. Okay, right about there. I'll do some reversing. Okay, we want to stop sewing, obviously a few inches from joining this up, so we can join this up first. Then we can continue to sew around there and secure it completely. Let's take it over to the table. Okay, these are the two ends that'll be sewn together, but obviously you can tell I have plenty of fabric. In fact, too much. So I'm going to chop this off so you don't see it. We didn't need to sew in any more panels. Now we have less fabric to work with. So everything's laying flat. I'm going to lay this on the table. I'm going to lift this panel up, and then I'm going to measure over a 1/2 inch because that's my seam allowance from the edge of this fabric, the one underneath. So there's my 1/2 inch, okay, on that. That's where I'll stitch it. Okay, with this panel laying flat here and the 1/2 inch marked, I'm going to lay this one over the top with its edges lined up for the most part, and I can see where that 1/2 inch line is. I'm going to strike a line a 1/2 inch from there on this panel. Then I'm going to measure over a 1/2 inch from that and mark that, and this is going to be our cut where the arrow is. The idea is that when these are sewn together, they'll be sewn together right at that mark, which will give us perfect amount of fabric to complete the circumference. So now I'm using the clear acrylic ruler, which will give me a perfectly straight edge to the edge of the fabric, which I've already cut nice and straight. So right there, and I'll strike a line. Now when you cut this, be careful not to cut the panel underneath it. Now these will be sewn together like this. 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just to make things easier, I'm going to flip this panel up and put double-sided tape along the edge of it so I can just baste it in place. So I don't want to have to fight all the material and keeping this edge lined up as I sew it. Then I can join them together like this. There we go. Whoa, fabric got stuck on the table, so my stitch went off a little bit, but nobody's going to see the inside, so I'm just going to back it up and sew as though it's still a straight line. Now I'm going to turn it right side out. Okay, we're starting from the bottom edge of the skirt. There's a lot of fabric here to do this top stitch. And again, you don't have to have a top stitch like we discussed earlier. This just is a more secure, more professional way. All right. My needle's buried so I can manipulate my fabric to get it in front of me and in my lap. I'm going to splay it apart and sew. Splay it apart. Bury my needle. Splay it apart. I'm making sure that I'm sewing through my 1/2 inch tail on the underside. I can feel it. It's right here. And a little bit of reversing. There we go. Now we have to pull it out of the machine from backwards. Now we turn it wrong side out again. Back and forth to complete our circumference. Okay, so see how that comes out perfectly? There's no excess fabric from stitch to stitch.
We'll just close up that unsewn area. We're going to skip ahead here to the end part where we do some reversing.
When you get to the end, do some reversing. And if the reversing falls out of your into your seam allowance, no big deal. Nobody will ever see it. Now we turn it right side out. Okay, we're shoving the skirt underneath the arm of the sewing machine. Now this time we definitely want the tail to be facing up. Why? Because water is going to be coming down like this, and we want it to be like a shingle on a roof. If the tail were facing down, let's get it to face down, and if we sewed our top stitch in the skirt like this, then water would go in here and possibly seep into the seam. So when you have water running, you always want the tail on the underside, a 1/2 inch tail, to be up. And you're sewing this top stitch on the upper panel, not the lower panel. Every other seam was horizontal, or I'm sorry, vertical. This is a horizontal seam, so this is important. We'll just start anywhere, and we'll do a little bit of reversing at the beginning. As we're sewing, we'll straighten out our fabric with our needle buried and splay our fabric apart, making sure our tail is facing up, and it is. Now we get to a certain point, I'm going to bury my needle, and you see all this excess fabric? I'm going to push it through the throat of the sewing machine so that I have a little bit more space to work without having to necessarily stop. And I'm also making sure that I'm not sewing through my cone. I can feel it under here. There's nothing here besides just these two panels of fabric. Whoa!
We will sew all the way around the circumference, and then when we reach our beginning point, we'll do some reversing. We will not show all of this. Let's move on. We'll be creating a hem at the bottom of our skirt, but if you don't have a skirt, you'd be adding this hem to the cone itself.
Okay, we're going to create a single hem on this project. We calculated for a 1-inch hem along the bottom edge. If you'd like to put a double hem, you can. Gives it more reinforcement. So we're putting double-sided tape around the entire perimeter on the inside surface so that we can easily create that 1-inch hem and then take it to the sewing machine and sew it. Okay, now we'll peel off the transfer paper and create that 1-inch hem. Does it have to be accurate? It's nice. I'm going to guess at it for the most part. If you want to measure it, you can. That looks like about a 1-inch hem. I'm going to go around the entire perimeter doing that. Canvas patterning ruler can help crease the fabric well and bond the double-sided tape to the fabric.
On our cone at the bottom edge, we had a 1/2 inch for seam allowance to join the skirt. But let's say that you had a hem on the bottom edge of the cone and no skirt. There you may want to add 1 inch for a hem rather than seam allowance. It just depends on the type of cone that you're making.
We're going to sew our stitch about a 1/4 inch from the raw edge, and I'm going to use the magnetic guide yet again, and we're going to start sewing right here on top of the seam and do reversing in that seam.
What I mean by raw edge is the inner edge of that 1-inch hem, so about a 1/4 inch from the raw edge of the
sew
fabric.
around. Try to grab the fabric, it's rather slippery. Okay, we're coming up to the part where we started sewing. I'm going to clip the tails off. And then we'll do reversing right on top of that again. And we're done.
Our cone cover for our fountain is now complete and ready to be installed. It will be a slightly tight fit, but a tight fit means less abrasion. However, if you wanted it to be a little bit easier to install, instead of adding just 1 inch around the bottom circumference, you can add 2. It's up to you. Coming up next is the full materials list and the tools that we used to make this cone-shaped cover. We use Top Gun fabric from Sailrite, which is a very heavy-duty cover fabric that is UV and water resistant, yet very abrasion resistant. Another great cover fabric is Top-Notch 9, which is slightly lighter for easier storage. You can find hundreds of great outdoor cover fabrics at the Sailrite website. If you have any questions about the process of making a cone cover or what types of fabric to use or anything else, feel free to give us a call or email us. We're glad to help. For more tutorial videos that may be of interest to you, click on a link here. And as always, it's your loyal patronage to Sailrite that makes these free videos available. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Sailrite, thanks for watching.